Well, trade ministers begin last-ditch talks today aimed at saving floundering negotiations on global trade. With the clock racing towards a mid-December deadline, global officials will meet in a bid to bridge differences. Meanwhile, in Brussels, EU foreign ministers are set to meet for their first talks on finances since negotiations collapsed this past June. For more, we're now joined by Ray Frenken, live out of Brussels. Ray.
Louisa, yes, and both the trade talks in London today and Geneva on Tuesday and Wednesday, and the foreign ministers meeting and the finance ministers taking place at the beginning of this week here in Brussels, all of them indirectly or directly maybe have to deal with the farm subsidies in the European Union. Now, why is this important? Oxfam this morning releasing a very interesting study. It says that, for instance, 60%, two-thirds of all the farm subsidies, the 9 billion euros that France gets from Brussels, goes to only 15% of the French farmers. It appears that a lot of big multinational agribusiness companies benefit directly from money coming out, taxpayers' money coming out of Brussels. Among these companies, not just big French companies like Crédit Agricole, the French banks, but also the likes of Dutch brewer Heineken, Tate & Lyle, of course, a sugar producer, but also several ministers listed by Oxfam today, including the Dutch farm minister and the Slovak farm minister. Both of them have farms and get substantial amounts of subsidies from Brussels. Now, especially the French figures could be very revealing, because if two-thirds of the French farm money goes to the big agribusiness companies, that could undermine the French arguments defending the continuation of the big chunk of farm subsidies that they get. So far, the public image of the French farmers getting the subsidies is that of the small goat farmer in the Roquefort region, but that turns out not to be the case. That's what these figures prove, and that could possibly undermine the French negotiating position. Is that going to happen? We're probably going to have to wait a few more weeks before that becomes clear. What is happening today, though, is that Peter Mandelson, as EU Trade Commissioner, kicks off his meeting later today in London. He talks to the foreign ministers here in Brussels. He has to find out whether or not he has a sufficient enough mandate to actually go sit at the table with the US, with India, with Brazil, with other members of the World Trade Organization to sort out this situation. And all that, of course, at a time that the UK presidency of the EU is trying to kickstart the EU budget talks. Now remember, back in June we had that very acrimonious summit under the Luxembourg presidency that ended in failure because the UK and France were not able to agree on the UK rebate, not able to agree on the farm subsidies. And it's taken more than 4 months for the UK presidency to actually begin to resume the negotiations. So today we're seeing the start of the endgame of the British presidency. And that start is basically described in this paper. It's 3 pages, 9 paragraphs long. And in it, the UK presidency outlines what it hopes to do. It has broken up the endgame basically into 3 different chapters, being the structure of EU spending, being the modernization of the budget, making it fit into a globalized society. And also it has a very key element in there called own resources. And when the UK is talking about that, it's talking about the UK rebate. So that could possibly also be discussed. What is also becoming clear that this is just the start of the end game. There's in 2 weeks from now another meeting of foreign ministers over there. They'll talk about the modernization of the EU budget. And then at the beginning of December, they will have another meeting before the EU Heads of State Summit to talk about the UK rebate and French farm subsidies. But we all know already it's going to be very, very difficult for Tony Blair to actually make this a successful outcome, because many of the European countries have already asked the UK to amend this paper that it's putting on the table today, because they believe that more should be done with the relative success of the Luxembourg proposal that already was put on the table back in June. Only the UK and France are basically keeping this from moving forward. And it seems, though, according to some critics here in Brussels, that Tony Blair has been very, very occupied with this fight against the French vision of the world, and thereby disregarding the needs of the 10 new member states who are basically waiting for a decision on the structural funds and the farm subsidies, of course, to be able to make major decisions on major infrastructural projects. And those decisions are going to have to be postponed if there's no EU budget within the next 2 months.
Ray, a very comprehensive outline. Thank you very much. Ray Frenken joining us live out of Brussels.